In this video, I'll be sharing a few things that I like to think about when drawing the butt. But before we get into it, I'd just like to thank everyone for supporting my first ever self-published book, Dynamic Figure Drawing Volume 1. It is a pose reference book filled from cover to cover with nearly 300 poses that I've drawn over the years. And I'm finally in my last stretch of stock with 50 books left. And once they're gone, there will be no more. So if you're interested in a pose reference book, please consider checking it out for yourself over at my website, emiliodecore.com, or click the first link in the description. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get right into how I draw the butt. So the very first thing that I like to think about when drawing a butt is the sacral triangle. Now, for those of you that don't know, this is a pelvis, and this is the sacrum. It's this triangular bone right between the iliac bones of the pelvis. However, the sacral triangle is not the sacrum itself, it's actually this area here on the lower back. And you'll notice that these 2 points here land almost directly where our back dimples are located. But for me, more importantly than that, it's the bottom point of that triangle that is the most helpful, only because it points directly to where the butt crack is going to come down. It acts as the center anchor for the drawing of a butt, similarly to the way the nose is the center anchor for a face. So when I'm actually drawing the butt, I'll start with just putting down the triangle first. And again, this point here at the bottom, if I draw a line coming straight down from that point, will give me what will be the butt crack, or the intergluteal cleft, as it were. From here, I like to put down this slightly obtuse angle right at the bottom of that line, and in fact, it kind of looks like if you were drawing the top part of an arrow. Then I'll draw 2 lines coming down from that angle, placed slightly near the center, but not quite the center, so as to leave a bit of a gap between the legs. Then from here, I move up to the top of the triangle, and at these 2 points here, I'll draw a C-curve arch coming from those 2 points like this. These arches are meant to represent the top of the iliac crest on either side of the pelvis, which are these 2 arches here. And actually, if we were to connect these 2 arches together, it would look like ye old in Emilio's staple, the simplified bird, or the highly coveted and interchangeable letter M, or upside down letter W, however you want to think about it. Then really all that's left from here is to connect the legs together, and you have a very simplified drawing of a butt. And so most of the information that I just put down there stems from the sacral triangle, so that's why typically I like to draw the triangle first before drawing the rest of the butt. The next thing I want to talk about that's helped me in the past when drawing butts is the gesture of the butt, which is the simplification of the forms of the muscles dumbed down to these 4 sort of ovals placed over the top of each other like this. If you put a line down the center of these 4 ovals, you'll get the butt crack, and if you trace the outer contour of the bottom of these lower ovals, it gives you the crease of the butt cheek. The separation of these 4 ovals will look something like this when we fill them in with 2 separate colors, and it's most commonly compared to the shape of a butterfly, as a butterfly shares the same sort of gesture. One thing that becomes clear after drawing this gesture is this dip that is created as these 4 ovals overlap, and right there at the center of this dip is where the greater trochanter is located, which is the widest point of the hip. This is one thing that contributes to that very prominent curvature in some people as the legs wrap around that bone. And when you erase all of this, you get a butt. One of the central ideas behind using this gesture really is the fact that all you're doing is closing the gaps on all 4 sides of those ovals, which gives you this trapezoid looking shape, which coincidentally is another useful technique for drawing a butt. If you use the ovals to find the trapezoid, or just started with that shape, it will still give you roughly the same result. Now for me, the only thing about this technique is that when you get to the part where you have to erase away the ovals, it can get very messy looking unless you're careful about where you're erasing, and it can kind of just get tedious if you had to do this every time you wanted to draw a butt. So personally, the way that I break this down into lines is by looking at the direction these ovals are going, with the first set of ovals coming in towards the center and the second set going out towards the thigh. And when I focus on just these directions as lines, it gives me these two greater than, less than signs that more or less conveys the same information as those two ovals. With the idea being that if you just draw this angle on either side of the butt crack, it will give you this straightforward guideline on where to place both the crease of the butt cheeks as well as the arch of the iliac crest at the top, giving you the same butterfly-esque shape. And when we draw the butt on top of this shape, you'll see that those ovals fit right into the rhythm created by those two angles that we drew in the beginning. Another thing about this shape that can be useful is that the gap that it creates makes it clearer to visualize how something like love handles or hip dips collect in that dip before moving out and over the thigh. The gap gives us all this space to work with when deciding where in that dip to place the upper hip, which can help you find different shapes of the hips and butt. Moving on, I wanted to talk in broad terms about the differences between a male butt and a female butt. Now, these are going to be the most common generalizations between the two, so of course this isn't meant to say that all men and all women will fall under these generalizations, but these are typically what are described as the differences. So we'll start with probably the most obvious difference between the two, and it's that a man's hips are narrower than a woman's hips. This doesn't mean that a man's hips will come straight up and down. There is an angle to them, just a more subtle angle. It's as if I took a straight line and just rotated it ever so slightly. This can give you the angle of a man's hips. Whereas with a woman's hips, the angle will be wider, etc. Again, this is a very common point, so I won't tread any more of this beaten path. The next difference is that the muscles of the butt are a bit more prominently defined on a man's butt than a woman on average. These two lines here indicate the contour of the glutes, which on a woman you can see lacks that definition. In fact, if you were to use these lines as a guideline to paint the butt, you can see that a man's butt can have many shifts in planes and generally is just more rigid looking. And because a woman's butt lacks that definition, it will look softer and rounder than the former. The reason why this is simply due to fat distribution between men and women. On a man's butt, the most prominent fat pads are located right at the bottom of the butt cheek and maybe even a little bit under that. A woman, on the other hand, has much more and larger fat pads that cover more area on the butt than a man. This is why, because of all the added fat on a woman's butt, it will look much less defined than a man. In a side profile, a man's butt may generally come down at a slight angle before curving back towards the leg, resembling the shape of like a teardrop almost. Whereas a woman's butt may have more of a consistent circumference from top to bottom. Now, of course, this goes without saying that these proportions don't apply to everyone. In fact, you can even switch these two proportions and it would still represent those of a man and a woman, where a man can have a very full butt and a woman can have a flatter, more subdued butt. In some cases, even like a pancake butt or the air quote office chair butt. As well as both equally being just as full and firm as one another. There are many factors that play into the shape of one's butt, so you can draw really any shape you want on anybody. This leads me to drawing the butt in a side profile view, and I usually begin a side profile with a simple horizontal C curve like this. Now, to explain what that curve represents, I'd like to back up a bit while I draw a very simplified rendition of the pelvis in a side profile. Okay, so here we have a pelvis from the side, and the initial line that we drew represents the top curve of the iliac crest. The muscles of the butt attach along the iliac crest down to the greater trochanter at the center like this, and this would just be the rest of the leg as it goes over the rest of the skeletal structure. And this shape in purple represents part of the iliotibial band, which travels down the thigh to the knee. Now, of course, it is a bit more complicated than this, and there are many more muscles within these individual shapes, but again, this is just a simplified breakdown of it. So, to go back to where we were, that is what the C curve we drew in the beginning represents. Now, at this point on that curve, there's going to be a slight dip. If we go back to our pelvis, that dip represents the actual dip on the pelvis itself. From that dip, the thigh is going to come out and curve inwards towards the knee. What you don't want to do is draw the leg coming straight down from the dip like this. This would be incorrect. Because you have to remember, going back to the pelvis here, that if we did that here, there would still be a bit of our skeleton jutting out from our leg, and that would be very painful. So instead, curve the thigh over the pelvis. For the actual butt itself, I get how it can maybe be confusing as to the width of the butt, like should it go this far back? Putting it too close will make the width of the leg too thin. So what I like to do is from this point here, I'll draw a straight line down like this, and this will give me roughly the width of the leg. And once I have this, I'll just add a simple C curve, erase this part here, and now I have a butt in a side profile. So it's almost like I'm just drawing a C curve and attaching it to the leg. The only adjustment we need to make though is that the back of the leg isn't actually a straight line like this, even though leaving it that way is perfectly fine, like who even cares? But for what it's worth, the back of the leg does curve out a bit as well before moving inwards towards the knee, similarly to the front of the leg. From a back view, instead of having the legs come straight down like this, they will come out at an angle and then in towards the knee. And this can add to the voluptuousness of a butt. Moving on now to the crease that is created by the butt cheeks themselves. Giving this crease its own gesture can actually affect the appearance of the angle of the butt. For instance, instead of drawing that crease with the downward force, if we invert that force, it can give the impression that we're looking up at a butt. We can also use both forces at the same time by drawing one crease pushing down and the other pushing up, which can help to sell the impression that one leg is moving forward and the other moving backward. This is another example of how inverting the force of the crease can give a whole new look to your drawing. With this pose, if we draw the crease just going across like this, it's still fine and you can probably call it a day here. But if you want to enhance the angle a little more, inverting the force of the line can help you achieve that looking up perspective. In fact, something you can do also is that instead of drawing the crease directly from where the cheek meets the thigh like this, from that same point, you can extend the leg just a bit further up and then adding the crease, and this will enhance the impression that this leg, because it's holding the weight of the figure in this pose, is really pushing against that butt cheek, making the actual cheek itself more compressed. So just experimenting with the rhythm of that crease can bring more variety to your butt drawings, like for example by drawing the crease in an upward trajectory like this, it can make it look like this person is clenching their butt. Visualizing the crease of the butt as though it were just the cross contour of the leg can also help in picturing the angle you're looking at the butt from. For example, with the cylinder, by drawing a cross contour with a force pushing down, it makes it look as though we're looking down on it, and the same is true vice versa. So if we have a butt with a flat crease, if I imagine the crease as just the cross contour of the leg itself and just push up on it, it can make this upward perspective more complete. One other thing about the crease is that if you kind of just extend the trajectory of those lines, it will actually lead you to the widest point of the hips, depending on how wide you want to go with it. You can think of the crease itself almost like if it was an arrow pointing to where the widest point will be. Now the rest of this video is just going to be a voiceless step-by-step for drawing the butt in a 3/4 view with 2-second intervals between each step. This is just how I like to do it, so if you find your own way, by all means, stick to that way. Jumping back in just to say that one thing I like to do sometimes too is that once I get to this point, instead of drawing the other cheek coming out like this, I'm gonna just kind of ride the trajectory of the first cheek almost as if we're just extending past it, and this can give your drawing a low perspective. And that's going to do it for today's video on drawing the butt. Now, I do think a part 2 is in order for drawing the butt in dynamic poses and whatnot, as this was just a video on drawing it in general. If you like this video, consider hitting the like button, and if you really like what I do, consider supporting me over on Patreon, where I share all of my videos early, weekly new figure drawing poses, NSFW figure drawings if you're into that, and more. And speaking of Patreon, of course, I can't end a video without thanking all of my patrons for all of their support. And last but not least, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again as soon as I can.